The rain falls on Berlin tonight, as it has fallen for days, turning the divided city into a labyrinth of shadows and whispered secrets. The year is 1956, and somewhere beneath the scarred earth, in the darkness 20 feet down, something waits to be discovered. Water seeps through cracks in the soil, following the contours of a tunnel that should not exist, dripping onto steel that was never meant to be touched by Soviet hands. In a warehouse on Neukölln Street in the American sector, men in headphones sit frozen, listening to voices that have just gone silent on the other end of their taps. They know what is coming. They have always known. Because 11 months ago, before the first shovel broke ground, before 3,100 tons of earth were secretly removed from beneath Berlin's flesh, a man sat in a meeting room in London taking minutes. His name was George Blake, and he was writing 2 sets of notes, one for his masters at MI6 and one for his true employers in Moscow. This is the story of Operation Gold, the most expensive intelligence operation of the Cold War, the tunnel that was betrayed before it was born, and the man who sold its secrets for an ideology he believed would save the world. Every word that follows is documented, every name is real, every date is verified. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. There's a lot of interesting stuff ahead. December of 1953. London sits under a gray sky that seems to have forgotten the concept of blue. Inside the building at No. 2 Carlton Gardens, a meeting begins that will change the course of Cold War espionage. The CIA and MI6 have gathered to discuss an audacious plan, a tunnel beneath Berlin to tap Soviet military communications. Alan Dulles, Director of Central Intelligence, has already approved preliminary planning in principle. Now the details must be hammered out between allies who do not yet know they have an enemy sitting among them. George Blake arrives early, as he always does. At 31 years old, he carries himself with the quiet confidence of a man who has survived the North Korean prison camps, who has proven his loyalty through suffering. His colleagues do not know that inside those camps, while subsisting on rice and turnips for 34 months, Blake read Karl Marx's Das Kapital to a fellow prisoner who had lost his glasses. They do not know that the man who returned to England as a hero had already decided that the wrong side had won the war. Blake opens his notebook and begins to write. Every word spoken in this room will be recorded twice, once in the official minutes that will circulate through MI6's halls, and once in a copy that will be handed to a KGB contact in a dead drop somewhere in London's fog-shrouded streets. He sketches the proposed tunnel route with careful precision. The drawing is small, simple, but it contains everything the Soviets need to know. The British representative outlines their experience with Operation Silver in Vienna, where from 1948 to 1952, they successfully tapped Soviet communications by digging a 70-foot tunnel. The CIA contingent listens, impressed. The Vienna operation required just 70 feet. Berlin will require 1,476 feet, 22 feet longer than the Empire State Building is tall. The cables run close to the border here, someone says, pointing to a map. Blake's pen moves across the paper. Less than 2 meters underground at this junction point, Blake writes. Blake listens. Blake draws. And in Moscow, someone else will soon be reading every word, studying every line, knowing exactly what the Americans and British are planning. The meeting adjourns. Blake gathers his papers carefully, making sure both sets of notes are secure. He walks out into the London afternoon, a man with 2 faces, 2 loyalties, 2 truths. In his pocket, wrapped in innocuous paper, lie the death warrants for an operation that has not yet begun. January of 1954. CIA Director Alan Dulles signs the authorization for what will officially be designated Operation Gold. In his office in Washington, he makes a decision that will haunt the operation's security. He orders that as little as possible should be reduced to writing. The irony will not become apparent for 7 more years, that the man trying to keep secrets is creating a vacuum where secrets can more easily disappear. In Berlin, the CIA's Berlin operating base, known by its cover name Bob, receives word that the tunnel project is approved. The man selected to run this audacious operation is William King Harvey, a 40-year-old former FBI agent who left the Bureau after an altercation with J. Edgar Hoover himself. Harvey is a hard-living man, legendary for the amount of liquor he consumes before lunch, notorious for carrying a gun at all times. His colleagues call him America's James Bond, though Harvey is more brutal than suave, more relentless than refined. Harvey has already proven himself by unmasking Kim Philby, the British intelligence service's top Soviet mole in Washington. Now he has been given an even more difficult task: to dig a tunnel under the most heavily guarded border in the world and tap communications that the Soviets believe are secure. Harvey begins assembling his team with obsessive secrecy. He operates on a need-to-know basis so strict that even Robert Murphy, BOB's second-in-command, will not learn about the tunnel's existence. This level of compartmentalization is known in intelligence circles as compartmented information. It is designed to prevent leaks. It will fail completely, because in London, George Blake has already passed his notes and sketches to his KGB handler. The information has been analyzed, discussed, debated at the highest levels of Soviet intelligence. A decision has been made that will shape everything that follows. The KGB will allow the tunnel to be built. They will sacrifice Soviet military secrets to protect something more valuable: their mole inside MI6. February of 1954. In the Rudow district of West Berlin's American sector, construction begins on what appears to be a warehouse. Local engineers are told it is an experiment in military construction, half above ground, half below, chosen for Berlin because labor rates are cheap and the work will benefit the local economy. They are not told the real reason for the unusually deep basement. They are not told that this 7-meter pit will serve as the staging area for a tunnel that will burrow beneath the most dangerous border on Earth. They are not told that the basement's primary purpose is to store 3,100 tons of excavated soil, enough earth to fill more than 20 average American living rooms. The cover story is elaborate and almost comically mundane. The warehouse will house a U.S. Air Force radar installation, complete with visible antennas and rotating equipment. The site is roughly the size of a city block, surrounded by chain-link security fencing. Inside, in addition to the warehouse, there is a combined kitchen and dining facility, barracks for the men who will work here, and a building housing 3 diesel generators to power all the facilities. West Berlin's mayor is told that American engineers are conducting geological surveys beneath the city because the Allies are concerned the Russians might sabotage the sewage system. He accepts this explanation. Everyone accepts the cover story. In espionage, people believe what makes sense to believe, and a sewage survey makes sense. What makes less sense is the massive scale of the operation, beginning beneath the innocuous warehouse. Captain Williamson of the United States Army Corps of Engineers has been placed in charge of the physical construction. Before breaking ground in Berlin, the Corps constructs a full-scale replica of the tunnel in the New Mexico desert, working out every technical challenge in secret. On September 2, 1954, the digging of the initial vertical shaft begins. The men work in shifts, around the clock. Every shovelful of earth must be carefully removed, carried up through the warehouse and stored in the specially constructed basement. Nothing can be taken off-site. Security dictates absolute invisibility. The work is backbreaking, claustrophobic, dangerous. The soil is sandy, unstable. Water is a constant problem. The tunnel must descend deep enough to avoid detection, but not so deep that it becomes structurally unsound. Every foot forward is a calculated risk. And in Moscow, at KGB headquarters on Dzerzhinsky Square, men sit in offices reading reports about every stage of the construction. They know the depth of the shaft. They know the planned route. They know that by the time the tunnel reaches its target, it will have consumed 125 tons of steel liner plate and 1,000 cubic yards of grout. They know everything, and they say nothing. Winter descends on Berlin with particular cruelty in 1954. The soil freezes, turning the ground into something like concrete. Construction slows but does not stop. Harvey drives his team relentlessly, aware that every day of delay increases the risk of discovery, though he does not know that discovery has already occurred thousands of miles away. The tunnel advances inch by inch through the frozen earth. British technicians arrive from the Royal Engineers and the British Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill. They bring with them expertise honed during Operation Silver in Vienna. Among them are the best cable jointers in Britain, Blake Reimer, a Scotsman considered the finest in his field, along with Les Sparks and Arthur Looms. These men do not know that the operation they are supporting has been compromised from conception. They work with dedication, with precision, believing they are striking a blow against Soviet secrecy. The irony would be crushing if they knew the truth. The tunnel is not merely a hole in the ground. It is an engineering marvel, a 6-foot diameter cylinder pushing through unstable soil beneath one of the most militarized borders in human history. The target is a cable junction less than 47 centimeters, 19 inches, beneath a busy street in Soviet-controlled Altglinica. The margin for error is microscopic. Harvey prowls the construction site like a restless specter, checking progress, demanding answers, pushing his teams harder. He has recruited double agents working for the East Germans, men who provide crucial intelligence about Soviet communications infrastructure. One of these agents, known only by the codename Sniper, delivers information about Soviet penetration of Western interests in Berlin. But Harvey does not know about the penetration that matters most. He does not know about George Blake. By February 25, 1955, the vertical shaft is complete. The tunnel now extends from the warehouse in the American sector toward the cable junction in Soviet territory. 1,476 feet of subterranean espionage, invisible from above, inaudible from the street level. In May of 1955, British technicians install the taps on the target cables. The equipment is state-of-the-art, designed to intercept communications without creating any detectable signal loss that might alert Soviet engineers to the tap. The Americans and British can now listen to telephone conversations flowing to and from Soviet military headquarters in Zossen, conversations between Moscow and the Soviet embassy in East Berlin, conversations between East German and Soviet officials. The intelligence begins flowing immediately. It is a bonanza beyond the wildest dreams of Western intelligence planners. May of 1955. The tunnel becomes operational, and suddenly the CIA is drowning in intelligence. At the height of the operation, American listeners monitor over 500 connections simultaneously, covering 121 voice circuits and more than 4,000 feet of teletype traffic. Reel-to-reel tape recorders spin constantly in the climate-controlled chamber beneath Berlin. Signal amplifiers boost the faintest whispers of Soviet communications. Every conversation, every teletyped message, every unguarded word flows into American and British ears. The tapes are sent to 2 processing centers, one in London staffed by 317 Russian émigrés and German linguists, another in Washington with 350 employees, They work in shifts, transcribing, translating, analyzing. The volume is staggering. 67,000 hours of Russian and German conversations. Teleprinter signals, many of them multiplexed, collected on magnetic tape and forwarded to Frank Rowlett's Staff D for processing. The intelligence is extraordinary. Detailed Soviet military order of battle, troop movements across Eastern Europe, identification of personnel working on Soviet atomic energy projects, air defense capabilities, nuclear weapons developments, early warning that the Soviets were establishing an East German army. Most crucially, evidence that the Soviets had no immediate plans for a military invasion of Western Europe. Harvey files regular reports with Allen Dulles. The CIA director is elated. Operation Gold initially costed at $50,000, but ultimately consuming more than $6.5 million, the equivalent of 2 Lockheed U-2 spy planes, appears to be the intelligence coup of the decade. But there is a secret within the secret, a horror nested like a tumor inside the apparent success. In Moscow, at KGB headquarters, officers are reading many of the same intelligence reports. They are analyzing which conversations are being intercepted, which communications lines are compromised. They are calculating exactly what the Americans and British are learning. And they are making a cold-blooded decision. They will not interfere. They will not feed obvious disinformation over the tapped lines, because that would tip off the CIA that the tunnel is compromised. They will not inform the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, about the tap. They will not tell the Stasi, East Germany's Ministry for State Security. They will not even inform the Soviet military personnel whose conversations are being recorded. Instead, the KGB will sacrifice Soviet military, political, and scientific secrets to protect one man. George Blake. April of 1955. George Blake receives new orders. He is being posted to Berlin to work under Peter Lunn at the MI6 Berlin station. His official assignment has nothing to do with the tunnel. He is supposed to recruit Soviet officers as double agents. In reality, Blake's posting is perfectly timed to allow the KGB to discover the tunnel once Blake is safely transferred away from any association with its planning. Before he leaves London, Blake meets with his KGB handler one final time to discuss the operation. The KGB's own high-level communications go over a separate system of overhead lines that cannot be tapped without the interception being obvious. But the GRU and Stasi continue to use the tapped cables, completely unaware that every word they speak flows into American and British ears. Blake arrives in Berlin in the spring, when the city is awakening from winter's grip. He settles into his new role, moving through the divided city with the confidence of a man who serves two masters and believes both causes are just. He gives the Soviets details of 400 MI6 agents working in Germany. He identifies British operations, compromises Western networks, destroys years of patient intelligence work. And still, the tunnel operates. Still, the tapes spin. Still, the Americans and British believe they have achieved a perfect penetration of Soviet communications. The cognitive dissonance is profound. Western intelligence is collecting genuine intelligence. There is no evidence that the Soviets are feeding disinformation over the tapped lines. The conversations are real. The strategic value is real. The military secrets are real. And yet the entire operation is compromised. Has been compromised from the moment Blake took his notes in that London conference room. It is a paradox worthy of a spy novel, except that it is real, documented, verified. The KGB is allowing hundreds of hours of genuine Soviet military communications to be recorded and analyzed. because protecting one mole inside MI6 is worth more than protecting those secrets. Harvey, who once unmasked Kim Philby, does not suspect that another, perhaps even more damaging traitor, is operating under his very nose in Berlin. Blake is careful, methodical, patient. He has survived North Korean prison camps. He has learned to hide in plain sight. The tunnel operates for 11 months and 11 days. Each day brings new intelligence, new insights into Soviet military capabilities and intentions. Each day, CIA analysts in Washington and MI6 analysts in London piece together a picture of Soviet strategic thinking. They learn about Soviet air defense systems. They discover gaps in Soviet radar coverage. They identify command structures, communication protocols, defensive capabilities. They listen to generals complaining about logistics, to diplomats gossiping about political tensions, to engineers discussing technical problems with military equipment. Harvey nicknames the operation Harvey's Hole, a joke that captures both his possessive pride in the project and the fundamental absurdity of what they have achieved. A hole in the ground that is producing more intelligence than entire networks of human agents. The cost has been staggering, but the intelligence seems worth every dollar. 1,750 intelligence reports are generated from the tunnel's take. 443,000 conversations are fully transcribed. 50,000 reels of magnetic tape fill warehouses in London and Washington. In Moscow, KGB analysts read summaries of what the Americans are learning. They make notes about which types of information are being compromised. They calculate the strategic impact of the intelligence loss. And they continue to allow it, because George Blake is worth more than any number of intercepted conversations. The operation has taken on a life of its own, a strange equilibrium where both sides are getting what they want. The West gets intelligence, the KGB gets to protect its most valuable agent, and the Soviet military gets betrayed by its own intelligence service. It cannot last forever. Nothing this elaborate, this fragile, can sustain itself indefinitely. The weather in Berlin is changing, spring rains are coming, and the KGB has decided it is time for the tunnel to be discovered. April of 1956. The rain that falls on Berlin this spring is exceptional, even by the standards of a city accustomed to gray skies and persistent drizzle. Day after day, water pours from leaden clouds, soaking into the earth, running through cracks in pavement, seeking the lowest point it can find. In the CIA listening post beneath the warehouse in Rudo, technicians notice moisture beginning to seep into the tunnel. It is not unusual. Groundwater has been a constant challenge throughout the operation, but the volume is increasing. Water drips onto equipment, pools on the floor, threatens sensitive electronics. In East Berlin, Soviet and East German engineers receive reports of problems with telephone cables. The heavy rains are causing short circuits throughout the network. A repair crew is dispatched to investigate a cable junction in Altglinica, near the municipal cemetery. The men who dig through the muddy earth on the morning of April 22nd are ostensibly looking for cable damage. They are supposedly surprised when, at approximately 19 inches below the surface, they find something unexpected: a tap on the cable and a chamber leading to something larger. The discovery is carefully choreographed. KGB personnel are ready. East German officials are prepared. Within hours, Soviet officers are photographing the equipment, examining the tunnel, marveling at the audacity and technical sophistication of what they have found. Inside the tunnel, microphones installed by the CIA pick up every word of the Soviet discovery. American listeners hear Russian and German voices discussing what they have found. They hear speculation about booby traps, debates about whether the door to the tunnel proper might be explosive. "A commission is expected," someone says in Russian. "We should await the arrival of this commission before making a decision," a Soviet officer replies. "Make motion pictures of the chamber. Enlarge the hole. Conduct a detailed inspection, but disconnect nothing yet." Harvey, monitoring the situation from the warehouse, knows the operation is over. He has had a good run, 11 months and 11 days of unprecedented intelligence collection. Now the question is, what happens next? At approximately 11:30 hours on April 22, 1956, Soviet and East German personnel are still unaware of the tunnel's full extent. They discuss the battery box, speculating about its purpose, worried about potential booby traps. They believe they can identify the perpetrators from the make of the materials and the techniques employed. Harvey allegedly posts a sign on the door at the American end of the tunnel. "You are now entering the American sector." It is gallows humor, a final gesture of defiance before retreating from what has become a propaganda disaster. At 15:50 hours, 3:50 in the afternoon, the microphone in the tunnel is cut. Operation Gold goes silent. The Soviets waste no time in turning their discovery into a propaganda victory. They announce the find to the international press, calling it a breach of the norms of international law and a gangster act. Journalists are invited to tour the tunnel to see for themselves the extent of American and British espionage. The propaganda campaign is carefully timed. The tunnel's discovery coincides with Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev's state visit to the United Kingdom, specifically occurring the day before a state banquet with Queen Elizabeth II at Windsor Castle. The timing is meant to embarrass the West, to demonstrate the lengths to which capitalist intelligence services will go to spy on the Soviet Union. But the propaganda backfires spectacularly. Instead of expressing outrage at Western espionage, most international press coverage marvels at the technical ingenuity and audacity of the operation. Newspapers around the world run photographs of the tunnel, focusing not on the breach of international law, but on the remarkable engineering achievement. "A brilliant piece of work," declares one editorial. "Extraordinary technical skill," says another. The Soviets have miscalculated. They wanted condemnation and received admiration. They wanted to embarrass the CIA and instead provided free publicity for American technical capabilities. Allen Dulles finds himself praised for an operation that was compromised from its inception. There is a quiet agreement, never officially acknowledged, that British participation in the operation will be downplayed in press coverage. Most photographs show equipment that is clearly British-built and labeled as such, but the narrative that develops focuses almost exclusively on the CIA. This protects MI6's reputation, though it does nothing to protect the agents Blake will continue to betray. Harvey receives the Distinguished Intelligence Medal in a secret ceremony officiated by Allen Dulles. The CIA considers Operation Gold a success, despite its eventual discovery. After all, they did collect 11 months of unprecedented intelligence on Soviet military capabilities. They do not yet know that every minute of those 11 months, someone in Moscow knew exactly what they were hearing. The years pass. The Berlin Tunnel becomes a legend in intelligence circles, a story told to illustrate both the audacity of CIA operations and the technical sophistication of Cold War espionage. The tapes continue to be processed, analyzed, cross-referenced. More than 2 years after the tunnel's discovery, analysts are still working through the mountain of intercepted communications. Studies are conducted to determine whether the Soviets fed disinformation over the tapped lines. The conclusion, documented in CIA reports, is that they did not. There were no known attempts to feed disinformation to the CIA, one report states. The Soviet military continued to use the cables for communications of intelligence value. This finding is simultaneously reassuring and puzzling. Why would the Soviets allow genuine intelligence to be compromised? The CIA analysts cannot answer this question because they do not know about George Blake. Blake, meanwhile, continues his work for the KGB. He moves from posting to posting, always careful, always disciplined, always gathering intelligence and passing it to his Soviet handlers. In 1955, before the tunnel was discovered, he gave the Soviets details of 400 MI6 agents working in Germany. He compromised British operations across Europe. He was involved in identifying Western agents operating behind the Iron Curtain, agents who were captured and, in some cases, executed. The exact number of deaths Blake caused remains classified even today. Some sources suggest 40 agents were killed as a result of his betrayals. Others put the number lower. Blake himself, in later interviews, would claim that the Soviets assured him no one was executed based on his intelligence, assurances he chose to believe. But in 1961, the web finally tightens around George Blake. January of 1961. A man walks into a CIA station in Europe and identifies himself as Michael Golanewski, a senior Polish counterintelligence officer who wants to defect. He brings with him information about Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services. Among the secrets Golanewski reveals is the existence of a high-level KGB mole inside MI6. The clues point toward someone who had access to the Berlin tunnel planning, someone who was in the right place at the right time to compromise the operation from its inception. MI6 begins a careful, methodical investigation. The circle of suspects is small. Only a handful of people attended those early planning meetings in London. George Blake's name surfaces. His background is reviewed. His assignments are examined. His behavior is analyzed. Blake is working in Lebanon at this time, enrolled at the Middle East Center for Arabic Studies. He is recalled to London under false pretenses, told he is needed for consultation on a routine matter. He arrives in London unsuspecting, confident in his ability to deflect suspicion. He is wrong. The interrogation begins in a quiet room conducted by professionals who have spent months preparing for this moment. They do not show their hand immediately. They ask general questions, probing for weaknesses, watching for tells. Blake, trained in resistance to interrogation by his North Korean captors, remains calm. He denies nothing, because he has not been accused of anything specific. He plays the role of the loyal MI6 officer, slightly confused about why he has been recalled, eager to help with whatever investigation is underway. The interrogators shift tactics. They present evidence, not all of it, but enough to make clear they know. They mention meetings Blake attended. They reference information that was compromised. They describe patterns of betrayal that match Blake's access and timing. Still, Blake holds out. He has spent years living a double life. He will not break easily. Then the interrogators make a suggestion, carefully worded, designed to provoke. Perhaps Blake was tortured in North Korea. Perhaps he was blackmailed. Perhaps his betrayal was not voluntary but forced, a response to threats or coercion. Blake's reaction is immediate and visceral. He is offended by the suggestion that he acted out of weakness. "No," he says, "nobody tortured me. Nobody blackmailed me. I myself approached the Soviets and offered my services to them of my own accord." The confession pours out. 3 days into his interrogation, Blake admits everything. He tells his MI6 interrogators how he switched sides voluntarily after reading Karl Marx in a North Korean prison camp. He describes his recruitment by the KGB, his decision to betray his country not out of coercion, but out of conviction. The interrogators listen, documenting every word. They are careful not to show their shock at the scope of Blake's betrayal. He has passed thousands of pages of classified documents to the Soviets. He has identified Western agents. He has compromised operations across multiple continents. And yes, he confirms, he attended the Berlin Tunnel planning meetings. Yes, he took notes. Yes, he gave those notes to his KGB handler. The tunnel was betrayed before the first shovel broke ground. May of 1961. George Blake stands in the dock at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. The trial is held in camera, closed to the public, sealed from the press. What happens in that courtroom will not be fully known for years. Blake pleads guilty to 5 counts of spying for a potential enemy under Section 1 of the Official Secrets Act of 1911. The maximum sentence for any single offense is 14 years. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Parker of Waddington, listens to the evidence presented by the prosecution. He learns the full scope of Blake's betrayal. Not just the Berlin Tunnel, but hundreds of agents compromised, operations destroyed, secrets sold for an ideology Blake believed would create the kingdom of God in this world. Lord Parker's sentence is unprecedented. 42 years imprisonment. 14 years consecutively on each of 3 counts. 14 years concurrently on the remaining 2 counts. It is the longest sentence imposed in modern British history, going back 150 years. Newspapers report that the sentence represents 1 year for each agent Blake betrayed, who was subsequently executed. This claim is dubious, not officially confirmed, but it captures the magnitude of Blake's betrayal in the public imagination. Blake is transported to HM Prison Wormwood Scrubs in West London. The facility is maximum security, designed to hold Britain's most dangerous criminals. Blake's cell is small, austere, containing a bed, a desk, a chair. He is 42 years old. If he serves his full sentence, he will be 84 years old when released. But George Blake does not intend to serve his full sentence. October 22, 1966. 5 years into his 42-year sentence, George Blake escapes from Wormwood Scrubs prison. The escape is amateur in execution, but perfect in result. Orchestrated not by the KGB, which does not want to risk exposure, but by 3 of Blake's fellow inmates who believe he has been treated unjustly. The plan is audaciously simple. Blake's Confederates smuggle a walkie-talkie into his cell so they can coordinate timing. They use a hacksaw blade to cut through iron bars on Blake's cell window. They throw a rope ladder over the prison wall. They drive away in a getaway car, disappearing into London's fog-shrouded streets. Blake hides in a safe house for several days while arrangements are made for the next leg of his escape. His accomplices, Sean Bork, Michael Randall, and Pat Pottle, help him travel to East Berlin via Brussels and Prague. The escape is entirely amateur, without KGB involvement, which makes it all the more remarkable that it succeeds. The British government is humiliated. The largest manhunt in British history is launched. Blake's photograph appears in newspapers across Europe, but he is already beyond reach. At the Helmstedt-Marienborn border crossing between West and East Germany, a favorite route for Cold War spies because it is the shortest land distance between the 2 sectors, Blake crosses into East German territory. KGB handlers are waiting. Within hours, he is on his way to Moscow. He will never return to the West. In Moscow, Blake is received as a hero. He is granted Soviet citizenship. He is given a spacious, rent-free apartment. He receives a pension from the KGB. He is awarded the Order of Lenin, the highest civilian decoration in the Soviet Union. He is made a KGB colonel, given the codename Diamid, celebrated in Soviet propaganda as a man who chose justice over capitalist corruption. Blake marries a Russian woman. They have a son. He settles into a comfortable life, believing he has made the correct choice, that history will vindicate his betrayal. In the West, his name becomes synonymous with treachery. John le Carré, the celebrated spy novelist who once worked for MI6, writes that Blake betrayed hundreds of British agents and gave away MI6's crown jewels. The entire breakdown of MI6's personnel, safe houses, order of battle, and outstations across the globe. The debate about Blake's legacy begins immediately and will continue for decades. Was Operation Gold a success, despite Blake's betrayal? Or was it a catastrophic failure? Did the intelligence collected justify the cost? Or was the entire operation a propaganda gift to the Soviets? The CIA maintains that the operation was successful. Despite KGB foreknowledge, the intelligence collected was genuine and valuable. The tunnel provided insights into Soviet military capabilities that informed Western strategic planning throughout the late 1950s. Others argue that any operation compromised from inception cannot be considered a success, regardless of the intelligence collected. They point out that the Soviets knew every word being intercepted, could have used that knowledge to manipulate Western perceptions, could have fed selective truths mixed with strategic deceptions. The truth, as documented in declassified CIA reports, appears to be somewhere between these extremes. The Soviets did not feed obvious disinformation. They sacrificed genuine intelligence to protect Blake, but they also ensured their most sensitive communications went over separate, untapped lines that the KGB controlled directly. It is a paradox worthy of the Cold War itself. An operation that was both a success and a failure, a triumph and a tragedy, a technical marvel and a security disaster. The 1970s. The Berlin Tunnel fades into Cold War legend, a cautionary tale about the limits of technical intelligence when human intelligence fails. The tunnel itself remains, sealed and forgotten, buried beneath a border that will stand for another generation. George Blake lives comfortably in Moscow, occasionally giving interviews, always maintaining that he acted out of conviction rather than coercion. In a 1991 interview with NBC News, he says he regrets the deaths of agents he betrayed, though he claims the Soviets assured him no one was executed based on his intelligence. In a 1992 interview with Canada's CBC Radio, Blake defends communism as a great experiment of mankind to create a more just society, to create, in fact, the kingdom of God in this world. He denies responsibility for any deaths, accepting Soviet assurances at face value, choosing belief over doubt. But others tell different stories. Alexander Koppel, a retired lathe operator living in Berkshire, describes being recruited by MI6 and sent on Operation Jungle to Soviet-occupied Estonia. The mission was doomed from the start. Betrayed, Koppel believes, by George Blake. Agents were captured, some were shot. Others were taken to Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters in Moscow, home to an infamous prison where spies and political dissidents disappeared. These are the real costs of Blake's betrayal, measured not in intercepted telephone calls or compromised cable taps, but in lives destroyed, families shattered, agents who trusted their government to protect them and found themselves abandoned behind enemy lines. William King Harvey, the swashbuckling CIA officer who ran Operation Gold, never knows the full extent of Blake's betrayal. Harvey dies in 1976, still believing the tunnel was eventually discovered through Soviet vigilance rather than pre-existing knowledge. He takes his Distinguished Intelligence Medal to the grave, a reward for an operation that was compromised before it began. 1996. More than 4 decades after the tunnel was dug, the Berlin city government contracts a local construction company to excavate approximately 83 meters of the tunnel from the former American sector to make way for a new housing development. In 1997, a 12-meter section is excavated from what had been the Soviet sector, under the guidance of William Dury. This section of the tunnel is preserved and displayed at the Allied Museum in Berlin, where visitors can see for themselves the sophistication of the engineering, the narrowness of the passage, the claustrophobia of the space where men once listened to Soviet secrets. The tunnel has become a tourist attraction, its horror sanitized by time, its betrayal reduced to a historical footnote. People walk through the preserved section, marveling at the technical achievement, taking photographs, discussing the ingenuity of Cold War espionage. They do not feel the weight of 3,100 tons of earth pressing down from above. They do not hear the drip of water seeping through cracks in the steel liner. They do not sense the presence of George Blake's ghost haunting a tunnel he betrayed before it was born. 2012. George Blake celebrates his 90th birthday in Moscow. His eyesight is failing. He describes himself as virtually blind, but he remains a committed Marxist-Leninist, still believing in the ideology that drove him to betray his country. In interviews, Blake insists he was never a traitor because he never felt British. To betray, you first have to belong, he says. I never belonged. It is a remarkable statement, revealing and self-justifying in equal measure. Blake, born Georg Behar in Rotterdam to a Dutch mother and a Jewish father of Middle Eastern descent, spent his entire life between identities, between loyalties, between worlds. His father fought for Britain in World War I and earned British citizenship. Blake joined the Royal Navy during World War II. He was recruited by MI6 in 1944. But belonging, Blake insists, requires more than service, more than sacrifice. It requires something deeper, a sense of connection, of shared identity, of cultural rootedness. And this, Blake claims, he never felt in Britain. Instead, he found belonging in an ideology that promised universal brotherhood, that claimed to transcend national boundaries, that offered a vision of justice divorced from the class consciousness and snobbery Blake encountered in British society. His girlfriend's family objected to their romance because of Blake's background. He was not one of them. He did not attend the right schools. He did not have the right connections. This rejection, Blake suggests, pushed him toward communism, a creed that promised to eliminate such distinctions. Declaring allegiance to communism was akin to a religious conversion, one historian writes of Blake's transformation. A man without a country or a cause had found a creed that filled the hole in his soul. But the costs of this conversion are measured in bodies, in compromised operations, in agents captured and executed. Blake's belonging came at a price paid by others. November of 2017. Blake, now 95 years old and living in Moscow, releases a statement through Russian media. He claims that intelligence officers now have the difficult and critical mission of saving the world in a situation when the danger of nuclear war and the resulting self-destruction of humankind again have been put on the agenda by irresponsible politicians. It's a true battle between good and evil, Blake declares. The statement is grandiose, self-important, revealing. Even at 95, Blake sees himself as a crusader, a man who made difficult choices in service of a higher cause. He does not acknowledge the agents who died because of his betrayals. He does not reflect on the possibility that his judgment might have been wrong. Instead, he positions himself as a savior, someone who understood that the real enemy was not communism or capitalism, but war itself, nuclear annihilation, the irresponsible politicians who would risk human extinction for political gain. There is something almost pitiable in this self-justification, this need to frame betrayal as heroism. Blake has lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse, to watch communism fail as a political system, to witness the ideology he believed would create the kingdom of God in this world, produce instead gulags and purges and totalitarian control. But he does not waver. He does not recant. He remains committed to Russia, to communism, to the choices he made in a North Korean prison camp 70 years earlier. December 26, 2020. George Blake dies in Moscow at the age of 98. The RIA Novosti news agency reports his death, citing Russia's SVR Foreign Intelligence Agency. Russian officials praise him as a hero, a man who served the cause of peace and justice. In Britain, the reaction is less generous. Newspapers recall the scope of his betrayals, the length of his sentence, the audacity of his escape. They note that he lived comfortably in Moscow for 54 years, enjoying a KGB pension, celebrated by the same regime whose secrets he helped protect. His former wife, Gillian Blake, had visited Moscow years earlier with their 3 sons to make peace with the unrepentant colonel. She later wrote of her realization when Foreign Office officials informed her of George's treachery. "When they told me he had betrayed the secrets of my country, it never crossed my mind that they had made a mistake. As I thought back to George's background and to the 6.5 years of our very happy married life, it all fitted in somehow. He must have always been simulating, living, so to speak, a lie, and living it rather ruthlessly." Living a lie. It is perhaps the most succinct description of Blake's existence. A man with 2 identities, 2 loyalties, 2 versions of truth. To his British colleagues, he was a dedicated MI6 officer, a hero who survived North Korean captivity. To his Soviet handlers, he was Diomed, a committed communist who chose ideology over nationality. The question that haunts Blake's legacy is whether he ever reconciled these 2 identities, whether he ever felt the full weight of his choices, whether he ever doubted the path he chose in that prison camp. His cousin, interviewed after Blake's death, insists, "George never has any regrets." But absence of regret is not the same as presence of peace. Blake lived to 98, outliving the Cold War, outliving the Soviet Union, outliving most of the people whose lives he destroyed. But he never returned to the West. He never saw Britain again. He remained in Moscow, a permanent exile, celebrated by a country that was not his homeland, mourned by almost no one in the country of his birth. The story of Operation Gold does not end with George Blake's death. It continues to resonate through the intelligence community, a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of technical operations to human betrayal. The tunnel itself remains partially preserved at the Allied Museum in Berlin, a physical monument to the ambition and limitations of Cold War espionage. Visitors can walk through the narrow passage, can see the equipment that once intercepted Soviet communications, can try to imagine the tension of working beneath the most dangerous border in the world. But the real legacy of Operation Gold is not in the tunnel or the preserved equipment or the museum displays. It is in the documents, the CIA histories, the declassified reports, the intelligence assessments that continue to be analyzed decades after the operation ended. In 2007, the CIA released a less redacted version of their internal history of the Berlin Tunnel. The document, designated Clandestine Services History Paper Number 150, and originally published internally in 1968, provides unprecedented detail about the operation's planning, execution, and eventual compromise. The document confirms what was long suspected. Blake informed the KGB about Operation Gold during the planning stages, possibly as early as late 1953. The Soviets knew about the tunnel before construction began in September of 1954. They allowed it to proceed for 11 months and 11 days, sacrificing military intelligence to protect their most valuable penetration of British intelligence. The document also confirms that the intelligence collected was genuine. Despite British SIS suspicions to the contrary, the CIA assessment states clearly, there were no known attempts to feed disinformation to the CIA. The Soviet military continued to use the cables for communications of intelligence value. This finding creates a paradox that intelligence historians continue to debate. How can an operation be considered successful if it was compromised from inception? How can intelligence be valued if the enemy knows it is being collected? The answer, documented in multiple CIA reports, is that the KGB made a calculated decision to sacrifice Soviet military secrets rather than risk exposing Blake. The KGB's own communications went over separate lines that could not be tapped without the interception being obvious. The KGB did not share its knowledge with the GRU or the Stasi, rival agencies it did not trust with such sensitive information. So the tunnel produced genuine intelligence about Soviet military capabilities while simultaneously being compromised at the highest levels. Both things were true at once, success and failure, triumph and betrayal, intertwined so completely that they cannot be separated. The broader lessons of Operation Gold extend beyond the specific details of the tunnel, beyond the particular betrayal of George Blake. They speak to fundamental vulnerabilities in intelligence operations, to the eternal tension between technical capabilities and human factors. The tunnel represented the cutting edge of signals intelligence in 1955. The equipment was sophisticated, the engineering was remarkable. The technical execution was nearly flawless, and none of it mattered, because one man with access to planning documents chose ideology over loyalty. This vulnerability, the human element in technical operations, remains relevant today. Modern intelligence agencies invest billions in technical collection capabilities, satellite imagery, signals intelligence, cyber operations. But these capabilities remain vulnerable to insider threats, to individuals with access who decide to betray their organizations. Blake was not the first such traitor and would not be the last. Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, the Cambridge Five had already demonstrated the capacity of ideologically motivated insiders to cause catastrophic damage to Western intelligence. Blake's betrayal reinforced the lesson. Technical superiority means nothing if the enemy knows your capabilities. The CIA's response to Blake's betrayal was to intensify security screening, to implement more rigorous background checks, to create systems designed to detect insider threats. But as subsequent cases, Aldrich Ames, Robert Hanssen, Edward Snowden demonstrate, these measures are imperfect at best. The fundamental problem is that intelligence agencies must grant access to secrets in order to do their work, and granting access creates vulnerability. There is no perfect solution to this dilemma, no technical fix that can eliminate the human factor. The Berlin Tunnel also illustrates the limits of compartmentalization as a security measure. William King Harvey implemented strict need-to-know protocols, keeping knowledge of the operation restricted to the smallest possible circle of people. Even BOB's second-in-command was kept in the dark. But this compartmentalization could not protect against Blake's betrayal because Blake had access at the planning stage, before compartmentalization could take effect. He attended meetings in London where the entire operation was discussed openly among Allied intelligence services. This points to a broader vulnerability in international intelligence cooperation. The CIA and MI6 needed to work together on the tunnel. British expertise from Operation Silver in Vienna was essential to the project's success. But cooperation required sharing information, and sharing information with MI6 meant exposing the operation to anyone with access to MI6's files. Blake exploited this vulnerability perfectly. As a trusted MI6 officer, he had legitimate access to planning documents. Nothing in his behavior or background immediately suggested he was a security risk. He had survived North Korean prison camps. If anything, this experience seemed to validate his loyalty and resilience. The red flags were there in retrospect. Blake's conversion to communism while imprisoned should have raised concerns. His eagerness to remain in intelligence work after such a traumatic experience might have seemed suspicious. But hindsight is perfect, and in the moment, MI6 saw a dedicated officer who had proven his courage under extreme duress. The propaganda aftermath of the tunnel's discovery reveals another layer of the operation's complexity. The Soviets intended to use the tunnel as evidence of Western aggression, as proof that capitalist intelligence services would stop at nothing to spy on the peace-loving Soviet Union. Instead, most international press coverage praised the technical achievement. The tunnel was described as brilliant, audacious, a remarkable feat of engineering. Even publications that might have been expected to condemn Western espionage found themselves impressed by the operation's scope and sophistication. This propaganda failure highlights a miscalculation on the part of Soviet planners. They assumed that the tunnel's discovery would embarrass the CIA and MI6, that the international community would condemn such an egregious violation of Soviet sovereignty. But the Cold War context shaped public perception in ways the Soviets did not anticipate. By 1956, the Soviet Union's own espionage activities were well known. The idea that Soviet intelligence services operated with restraint or respect for international norms was laughable. The tunnel, therefore, was seen not as an outrage, but as a clever response to Soviet espionage, a technical solution to the problem of Soviet secrecy. Allen Dulles, who had ordered that, as little as possible, be reduced to writing about the operation, found himself celebrated for a success he knew was compromised. He accepted the praise publicly, while privately understanding that the operation's security had been breached from the beginning. This disconnect between public perception and classified reality characterizes much of Cold War espionage. Operations were declared successes even when compromised. Failures were recast as learning experiences. The truth remained classified, while myths circulated publicly. The personal toll of the Berlin Tunnel and Blake's betrayals remains difficult to quantify. How many agents died because Blake compromised their identities? How many operations were destroyed? How many intelligence networks were rolled up by the KGB? The exact numbers remain classified or disputed. Blake himself claims he does not know how much damage he caused. "I don't know what I handed over because it was so much," he said in one interview. But there are individual stories, fragments of the larger tragedy. Alexander Koppel and Operation Jungle. 40 agents Blake identified who were captured, some executed. 400 MI6 agents working in Germany whose identities Blake gave to his Soviet handlers. Countless operations compromised, years of intelligence work destroyed. These are not abstractions. They are human beings, agents who believed their governments would protect them, who took enormous risks to gather intelligence, who trusted that their identities would remain secret. Blake's betrayals destroyed their lives, destroyed their families, destroyed the trust that made intelligence cooperation possible. And what did Blake give the Soviets in return for these betrayals? According to CIA reports, he passed more than 4,720 pages of classified documents to the KGB. The documents contained details of MI6 and CIA operations, agent identities, technical capabilities, strategic plans. The scope of the betrayal is staggering. Blake was not a casual spy, passing information opportunistically. He was systematic, methodical, comprehensive. There was not an official document on any matter to which I had access which was not passed on to my Soviet contact, Blake confessed at his trial. This totality of betrayal, this determination to compromise everything he could access, suggests a degree of ideological commitment that goes beyond simple espionage. Blake believed he was serving a higher cause, that his betrayals were justified by the greater good of communist victory in the Cold War. The escape of George Blake from Wormwood Scrubs prison in 1966 remains one of the most embarrassing episodes in British intelligence history. That three amateur conspirators, Sean Burke, Michael Randall, and Pat Pottle, could successfully break a convicted spy out of a maximum security prison raises questions about the competence of British prison security. The escape was not technically sophisticated. A rope ladder, a hacksaw blade, a walkie-talkie. These were the tools that defeated supposedly impenetrable walls. The getaway plan was improvised, relying on timing and luck rather than careful planning. And yet, it worked. Blake escaped and made his way to Moscow, where he would live for another 54 years, beyond the reach of British justice. The escape triggered the largest manhunt in British history, but Blake was never recaptured. The three men who helped him escape, Burke, Randall, and Pottle, were eventually tried for their role in the escape, but public sentiment had shifted by then. The trial resulted in acquittals or light sentences, with many viewing Blake's 42-year sentence as excessively harsh. This public sympathy for Blake's escape reveals an interesting dimension of his betrayal. While Blake himself was condemned as a traitor, his sentence was seen by many as disproportionate, a product of Cold War hysteria rather than measured justice. Blake cultivated this image in later interviews, presenting himself as an idealist persecuted for his beliefs rather than a traitor who caused deaths. He emphasized his voluntary conversion to communism, his principled opposition to Western imperialism, his belief in a more just world order. Whether this self-image was genuine or calculated remains debatable. Blake was trained in deception, skilled in presenting different faces to different audiences. His protestations of idealism may be sincere, or they may be one more layer in a lifetime of lies. In 2019, journalist Steve Vogel published Betrayal in Berlin, the true story of the Cold War's most audacious espionage operation. The book represents the most comprehensive account of Operation Gold to date, based on years of archival research, access to declassified documents, and rare interviews with surviving participants, including George Blake himself. Vogel's research confirms many details that were previously classified or disputed. The book provides a virtually month-by-month account of the tunnel's excavation and operation, drawn from CIA documents and interviews with more than 40 people involved in the project. The book also provides new details about Blake's betrayal. Vogel confirms that Blake informed his KGB handler about the tunnel during the planning stages, well before construction began. He describes how the KGB made the calculated decision to protect Blake by allowing the operation to proceed, sacrificing Soviet military intelligence to preserve their most valuable penetration of British intelligence. Perhaps most significantly, Vogel's book documents that the Soviets valued Blake so much that they feared his exposure more than a breach of their secrets. This statement, drawn from KGB documents and interviews with former Soviet intelligence officers, explains the paradox at the heart of Operation Gold: how an operation compromised from inception could nevertheless produce genuine intelligence.
The KGB's decision reveals something profound about intelligence priorities in the Cold War. Blake was more valuable as a long-term source inside MI6 than the tactical intelligence lost through the tunnel. This calculation, sacrificing immediate intelligence gains to protect long-term penetration, demonstrates sophisticated strategic thinking on the part of Soviet intelligence. The physical legacy of Operation Gold can be seen today at the Allied Museum in Berlin, where a section of the original tunnel is preserved and displayed. Visitors can walk through the narrow passage, can see the steel liner plates that held back the earth, can touch the equipment that once intercepted Soviet communications. But the tunnel on display is sanitized, safe, divorced from the claustrophobic reality of its operational years. The museum cannot recreate the tension of working beneath a border where discovery meant international incident. It cannot convey the psychological pressure of knowing that Soviet guards patrolled just feet above. It cannot communicate the betrayal at the operation's heart. The tunnel has become a symbol of Cold War ingenuity, celebrated in museums and history books as a triumph of technical espionage. The fact that it was compromised from inception is mentioned but often downplayed, treated as an unfortunate footnote rather than the central reality of the operation. This sanitization of history serves a narrative purpose. It allows Operation Gold to be celebrated as a success, despite overwhelming evidence of compromise. It permits the CIA and MI6 to claim credit for a brilliant operation while minimizing the security failure that allowed Blake's betrayal. But the full story is more complex, more troubling, more honest. Operation Gold was both a technical triumph and a security disaster. The tunnel itself was an engineering marvel. The intelligence collected was genuine and valuable, and the entire operation was known to the enemy from the moment it was conceived. All of these things are simultaneously true, and wrestling with that complexity is essential to understanding not just Operation Gold, but the nature of intelligence work itself. The influence of Operation Gold extends beyond the specific operation to shape subsequent intelligence practices. The lessons learned from the tunnel's compromise, both its technical successes and its security failures, informed CIA and MI6 operations for decades afterward. The technical successes were studied and replicated. The methods developed for the Berlin Tunnel informed subsequent signals intelligence operations. The engineering solutions, how to dig covertly, how to store excavated material, how to maintain climate control in a buried facility, became part of the institutional knowledge of intelligence agencies. But the security failures were studied even more closely. Blake's betrayal prompted a comprehensive review of MI6's vetting procedures, background checks, and counterintelligence practices. The ease with which Blake passed information to the Soviets revealed vulnerabilities in document security, in compartmentalization protocols, in the assumptions MI6 made about officer loyalty. These reviews led to significant changes in how Western intelligence agencies handled classified information, how they vetted personnel, how they structured operations to minimize the damage a single traitor could cause. But, as subsequent cases demonstrate, no system is perfect, and the insider threat remains a permanent vulnerability. The Berlin Tunnel also influenced Soviet intelligence practices. The KGB learned from the operation, improving its own technical capabilities, developing better methods for protecting communications, creating redundant systems to prevent similar compromises. More significantly, the KGB learned the value of long-term penetration operations. Blake's ability to compromise Operation Gold from the planning stage demonstrated the strategic superiority of human intelligence over technical collection. This lesson shaped Soviet intelligence priorities for the remainder of the Cold War. The ethical dimensions of Blake's betrayal continue to generate debate among historians and intelligence professionals. Was Blake a traitor motivated by ideology, or an idealist who chose a different loyalty? Is his 42-year sentence evidence of justice served or Cold War excess? Should his subsequent escape be condemned or celebrated? These questions have no simple answers. Blake himself frames his actions in terms of ideological commitment. To betray, you first have to belong. I never belonged. This formulation suggests that betrayal requires a prior allegiance, and Blake claims he never truly felt British despite his service, his marriage, his career in MI6. But this claim is self-serving and ultimately hollow. Blake's betrayals caused real harm to real people. Agents died because Blake compromised their identities. Operations failed because Blake passed secrets to the Soviets. Intelligence networks were destroyed because Blake could not be trusted with the information he was given. Whether Blake felt British is irrelevant to the consequences of his actions. The agents he betrayed did not care whether Blake felt culturally rooted in Britain. They cared that their trust was rewarded with compromise and exposure. Blake's ideological justifications, his belief in communism as the kingdom of God in this world, his claim to be serving humanity rather than betraying Britain, ring hollow when measured against the human cost of his espionage. Ideology does not excuse betrayal. Belief does not justify the deaths Blake caused. The final years of George Blake's life present a stark image of the consequences of his choices. He lived comfortably in Moscow, celebrated by Russian intelligence services, awarded the Order of Lenin, granted a pension and spacious apartment. But he was also alone, separated from his family, exiled from his homeland, existing in a kind of gilded isolation. His ex-wife Jillian visited him in his later years, bringing their 3 sons to make peace with the man who had betrayed not just his country, but his family. The visit is both touching and tragic, a family reuniting across the divide created by ideology and espionage. Blake remained unrepentant to the end. In interviews conducted in his final years, he continued to defend communism, to justify his betrayals, to insist he had made the correct choice. He never expressed genuine remorse for the agents who died because of his espionage. This lack of remorse is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Blake's legacy. It suggests either profound ideological commitment or profound psychological dissociation, an inability or unwillingness to confront the human consequences of his actions. When Blake died in December of 2020, he was 98 years old, blind, alone in a foreign country. He had outlived the Soviet Union, had seen communism fail as a political system, had witnessed the ideology he served collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But he never wavered. He never recanted. He remained committed to the beliefs that drove him to betray his country, his colleagues, his friends. The story of Operation Gold is ultimately a story about secrets, how they are kept, how they are stolen, how they shape the world even when they remain classified. The tunnel beneath Berlin was a secret operation compromised by a secret agent reporting to a secret enemy. The intelligence collected was secretly processed, secretly analyzed, secretly used to inform Western policy during the Cold War. and the compromise itself remained secret for years. Even after Blake was arrested and sentenced, the full extent of his betrayal was not publicly known. The CIA continued to assess the tunnel's intelligence value without acknowledging that the Soviets had known about the operation from inception. This architecture of secrets, secrets within secrets, lies layered upon lies, characterizes intelligence work during the Cold War. The truth was often classified, available only to those with proper clearances and need to know. Public narratives were carefully crafted to support policy goals rather than to reflect reality. Operation Gold was publicly celebrated as a brilliant success. Privately, intelligence officials knew the operation had been compromised. These two truths coexisted without apparent contradiction because the classified reality did not need to align with the public story. The declassification of Operation Gold documents in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has allowed historians to piece together a more complete picture of what actually happened. But even now, aspects of the story remain classified, details withheld for reasons of national security or diplomatic sensitivity. The full truth about Operation Gold may never be completely known. Documents remain sealed. Participants have died. The KGB's complete files on Blake and the tunnel have not been made public. What we know is fragmentary, pieced together from declassified reports, interviews with survivors, and archival research. But what we do know is horrifying enough. A tunnel built with extraordinary effort and expense, compromised before construction began, producing genuine intelligence while simultaneously being monitored by the enemy, discovered in a staged propaganda event, and ultimately vindicated as a success despite catastrophic security failure. Berlin today bears little resemblance to the divided city of 1956. The wall fell in 1989. The border that once divided the city with barbed wire and guard towers now exists primarily in historical memory. The Cold War is over, won by the West through economic exhaustion rather than military confrontation. But beneath the city's streets, in a section of tunnel preserved at the Allied Museum, Operation Gold remains, a physical reminder of an era when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation, when intelligence agencies fought shadow wars beneath divided cities, when men like George Blake made choices that shaped the course of history. The tunnel cost more than $6.5 million in 1955 money, the equivalent of 2 U-2 spy planes. It required the removal of 3,100 tons of soil, the installation of 125 tons of steel liner plate, the labor of engineers and intelligence officers working in shifts for months. It operated for 11 months and 11 days, producing 50,000 reels of magnetic tape, 443,000 transcribed conversations, 40,000 hours of recorded telephone calls. And from the moment the first planning meeting occurred in London, George Blake ensured that every detail was known to the KGB. The horror of Operation Gold is not supernatural. There are no ghosts, no demons, no inexplicable terrors. The horror is entirely human. The realization that trust can be betrayed, that secrets can be sold, that ideology can justify any betrayal. George Blake died in Moscow in December of 2020, unrepentant, celebrated by Russian intelligence, condemned by history. He was 98 years old, blind, a living relic of a war that ended before he did. The tunnel remains, preserved behind museum glass, a monument to human ingenuity and human betrayal, to the ambition of intelligence agencies and the vulnerability of their operations, to the price paid by agents whose identities were compromised
and whose lives were destroyed. Operation Gold was both a triumph and a tragedy. Both things are true. Both things will always be true. The horror is in holding both truths simultaneously, in understanding that success and failure can coexist, that brilliant operations can be completely compromised, that technical sophistication means nothing when human loyalty fails. The rain that falls on Berlin today is just rain, water from clouds, gathering in puddles, running through storm drains. But on certain nights, when the weather turns cold and the fog rolls in from the east, it is possible to imagine water seeping through cracks in buried steel, dripping onto equipment that no longer functions, echoing in a tunnel that was betrayed before it was born. The tunnel is silent now. The voices it once carried, Soviet generals discussing military strategy, diplomats sharing secrets, officers planning operations, are memories recorded on magnetic tape in archives in Washington and London. But the lesson of Operation Gold echoes still, that secrets are only as secure as the people who keep them, that technical brilliance cannot overcome human betrayal, that the most sophisticated operations can be undone by one man with access and ideology. George Blake is dead. The tunnel is sealed. The Cold War is over. But the horror of what happened beneath Berlin in 1955 remains, documented in classified files and declassified reports, preserved in museums and memories, a cautionary tale about the limits of trust and the costs of betrayal.